everyone, welcome to our next episode of Emergente for the Australia Latam Emerging Leaders Dialogue. Today I am really excited to be interviewing Camila Crescimbeni, who is one of our alumni from our first dialogue back in Argentina in Buenos Aires in November 2019. And she is a member of Congress, or Diputada de la Nación. I think I have right in my very nascent Spanish.
Perfect.
And Camila is here with us today, and we're going to have a bit of a chat about her views on Australia, Latin America, Argentina, and what it's like being a woman in leadership and politics in, I guess, 2020 during a really different time in history. So welcome, Camila. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure, and it was a pleasure ever since I met you. We had so many things in common and so much to share between us and with the world. So thank you for this interview. I'm very happy to be here with you all.
Thank you, thank you. I remember the day we met where we finally got you there and the mad rush for the dialogue, and it was such a fantastic occasion. Our Australian embassy was so kind to host us. So very good memories in a time when we can't actually travel. So Camila, you were elected to Congress. You were 29 when you were elected. So you're a young Congress member. What motivated you to go into politics?
So I just didn't hear your question right. I think, can you repeat that?
I said that you were elected at 29 to go into Congress. And so, you're relatively young to go into politics. So what motivated you? What was the motivation to become a politician?
Well, so it goes far back. Like when I was a younger girl, and honestly, this is a true story. I was 11 when we had this very huge socioeconomic crisis, a massive crash of the peso and the dollar. Many people know about this because it was a worldwide known crisis. But for those who don't know this, we had a very huge devaluation, and poverty rocketed over to 50%, which is maybe what we're reaching right now in the COVID world also. So it's a similar social context. And unemployment rose too. It was a very hard time, and inequality rose a lot. And I was very young at the time, but I remember my parents had always invested a lot of money in education. Everything we had, we were a very middle class, like working middle class family. Everything went to our education. And I remember coming out of school with my books ready. I was always a very nerdish, very studious girl, going to my house to study. And I saw this guy who was about my same age, who was collecting cardboard for a living, which is something in Argentina, it's called cartoneros. It's something that was very common at the time. And we, at that time, we looked at each other, and something happened to me, and I think it was reciprocal, because I realized how intrinsically unfair it was that I was in this place and he was in that other situation or context, just because of the place where we'd been born. So that moment on, I started doing, when I was a little older, around 14, 15, social work in one of the provinces of Argentina, Chaco. But then I decided that I wanted to study political science at a very, very early age, because that my calling, I think, was to work for a better human development in Argentina. So from then on, I went on to study in the US, then in France, and then back in Argentina. And I decided to get into government, where things really get to transcend. So I started working in Ministry of Education at the time in the city of Buenos Aires, working in poor neighborhoods in something that's called polos educativos, like schools that basically go from kindergarten over to secondary school in very poor slums with challenging education projects. And then I went on to be director of youth in the Ministry of Social Development, and also to get very involved in politics in the party. So I was president of the youth wing of my party, and I'm currently a member of the Council of Pro Argentina. So that's, in a nutshell, everything I've done. But my real calling, why I got into politics, is because I realized how huge inequality was in Argentina, and how much we needed to do from within the state and policy to make our well, some people say Argentina is condemned to failure. I disagree completely with that. I am sure that we can organize ourselves better. So that's what the reason I got into politics.
Which is, you know, a great motivation. And, you know, I think it's interesting that you say that, you know, Argentina doesn't have to fail. It didn't used to be a failure. So, you know, there's always that opportunity and possibility. One of the things when I came out to Argentina was what a great opportunity it was for Australia to be able to work with this country that we actually have a lot in common with. And I guess we've just sort of forgotten about over the years. And like I said before, we met at the Australia Latam Emerging Leaders Dialogue at the Embassy in Buenos Aires. So what do you see as Argentina's role in Latin America now? And I guess looking out even from there, what your role is in the world. I did know that you had gone to the US and France, but also your profile says you speak a bit of Mandarin as well. So you obviously are looking out. What is your view on where Argentina sits globally?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because Argentines aren't used or not too used to looking out into the world. Like, we're also sometimes very endogamic in our discussions. We're always discussing inflation rates. We're always discussing what's happening with our dollar. And I think that's one of the reasons why where we're not doing so well in some issues. So because we're sometimes looking at ourselves as if we were isolated from a world that's very, very globalized. Like it or not, that's the way it works. So I think both Latin America are important, and both Latin America and Europe and Asia, which is something we never, ever, ever discuss. You guys, well, you're closer to Asia, so it's closer educationally or during the time, or you can read it in the newspapers. In Argentina, somehow this weird thing happens where, like, we think of ourselves as a scissor cut picture that's underneath Spain in Europe. We think that's where we belong or we should be. Yeah. You know, that's very part of our elites, our political elites would wish for that, but that's just not going to happen. So we don't have, I think, such a good, I wouldn't say relationship, but we have much more potential to grow in Latin America. And so far our leaders have not taken too much time to get a more Latin Americanist view and to lead the continent, which is many of other countries always look at us and saying, like, why don't you take your role in Latin America like you could have, like Brazil is doing. I think that's something that should go into our discussions, generationally speaking, across all parties, because that would be public policy, like a real state policy, which is something that we always say in Argentina we lack, because we're always going from one model to another and we don't have too many things we agree on. And also, like you mentioned, Asia, I grew interested in China when I was working as the Minister of Education, because we signed this agreement with China to start fresh, new, 100% public and free Chinese Argentine school for kids in a poor neighborhood. Because how amazing can your life be, or what great opportunities would this offer to you if you go into public education and speak Chinese perfectly when you graduate? So I grew interested in how China and how all of Asia is absent from not only our discussions, but you do not speak of Asia when you're at university, when you're at secondary school. It's like that part of the world didn't exist to us, to our history, to our philosophy. And well, that's where we're going to have to sell our products. We're very high, like we do a lot of exports. So we really need to be in touch, not only generationally. I think our older leaders also should take an interest in Chinese, not only markets, but also in culture and education.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one that I noticed when I was out there last year. There was a conversation around how could Australia and Argentina work better together on, I guess, Argentina's capacity to work with Asia, because we've been here and we've been doing it for a long time. And like Argentina and many other countries in your region, the big trading partners are Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia. It's going to be more with India. So if there's a way that we can kind of come together and do that, because from an Australian perspective, if we don't do it, then Canada might come and work with you, and we want to be a part of that. So I think that's a big opportunity there. For us to actually do a lot more together, and I guess see some of Australia's, like, how can Australia be valuable to Argentina? I think that's one really key way. But I guess there is that element of getting your shop in order. And at the moment, obviously, there's the COVID-19 crisis. That's come off the back of already a difficult year economically. I remember being in Argentina when the peso went from, I think it was 50 pesos to the US dollar, and then the next day it was 70, and I was like, if coming from Australia, it was really surprising. So you've had a difficult year. How's COVID impacted life in Argentina and the economy in Argentina this year?
Well, so the first answer to that would be a lot. Honestly, we of course, we're coming from a very fragile situation, and we're renegotiating our debt with the IMF at this time. So we're talking about our country, which is not stable economically. That's one of the main reasons why we go so much from cycles to another. And actually, we have one of the worst records in terms of economic cycles, of how short and intense each of the economic cycles are. And obviously this pandemic and the fact that we're mainly at home and preserving the sanitary situation, that really meant, like everywhere else in the world, that a lot of people not only maybe not lost their jobs, but we have a huge informality rate in Argentina, which is something different from other countries. So with the formal workers, we had like this a certain set of policies. The government started aiding companies in paying salaries to workers. But the thing is, we have also over a third of our economy that's informal. So we also had to take a lot of time to design policies for those. Many are new poor. Many are people who never went over to assistance from the state, and now they're requiring assistance. So we have around 10 million people in that situation, which is a big number for around 44 million population. So the economic situation right now is very difficult, very hard to bring on a positive note on this, because I'm guessing people are very, very sick and tired of watching TV and seeing how everything's crumbling down. I think that we do stand a chance of recovering from this, but that will require a very intense dialogue across parties. That's kind of sine qua non, in my opinion. It's very important that we do that together, because, again, poverty's getting closer to 50% of the population, which is really terrible for our present and for our future, especially among young kids and adolescents, where poverty rates are higher.
Yeah, it's that kind of COVID generation, isn't it, of kids that are missing out on. It's the same here in Australia. I don't want to say it's any different at all. You've got the people who have never been on welfare before, people who are now having to go on to welfare from the state. And then you've got kids who aren't attending school, and you've got a big divide between kids, kids that can do education at home on an iPad, like my daughter can, and then you've got kids who are, you've got a single mum at home with 3 kids, and she's trying to work, and there's no spare laptops for these kids. So you've got this really big divide that's happening, and I think we'll be studying this for a long time. What are the impacts on these kids over time in this very sort of precarious educational environment? So some of these are the most important years of their lives, and they're just not getting the access to the education. So I think we're facing really similar challenges. And then the question, I think, for both of our countries is, what is the roadmap out? What's Argentina's plan? What are the steps you're taking to get through this crisis?
So one of the things you just mentioned, I didn't want to forget, is when we speak about access to technology, we're starting to investigate and to think about projects, not only to access technology, but to how to use technology. Because you can provide the computers, which is something we've done in Argentina in the past, to provide an actual netbook or an actual tool. But the thing is how you teach those kids to how to access the opportunities that lie within the internet or technology, which is something very different, and it's very related to education. So we're thinking about programs that can help us from a very early age to onset that stimulation towards critical thinking and how to actually use all the tools that you can get on. Because you can use the internet to get into a YouTube video and just watch reggaeton, which is amazing, but maybe it's not just, you cannot just get educated on one issue, or you can use internet to get into edX and get on a free course on Chinese history or sustainability. So that's to spark up the motivation and the stimulus about what's out there. And that's a very hard thing that we've been doing when we were in government before, and we're thinking is how to help provide not only information but also knowledge as to what's out there, and how you, even if you're underprivileged and if you were born in a house where you don't have all of your material necessities covered, you are valuable to Argentina, and you're valuable to yourself and your family, and you have an opportunity. Because that's something that's not very common in Argentina. Our mindset is very negative. And that's something that we should also work on in this pandemic, because like I said before, if all of us think that our country is destined to failure, and I've heard this from a lot of people around the world saying, hey, you guys, when you go around the world, you're one of the only countries that speaks so ill about your country abroad. So that's one of the things I think we should just quit doing, because we have a lot of fertility of opportunities. So technology, and we just passed a law on tax cuts for knowledge-based economy, which is, I think, a very good investment in our future for everything that goes from bio or spatial bioengineering to software exportation. So all of that industry and all of that part of the economy is being accompanied in order to promote more job creation, especially for young people. So that's one thing we're really looking forward to catalyzing in Argentina. Yeah. Two, I think we should imitate the system in other areas of the economy. For example, tourism, which is also very affected by, hugely affected by COVID, and it's 10% of our GDP. And it's also providing dollars, which is something we need to overcome our external restriction and our instability in economy. And obviously, but it's more obvious, but it's also very important that we mention it, our agricultural and our agro-exporting nature as a country. So the fact that we can add value to our raw materials and go on to our agreement signed last year with between Mercosur and Unión Europea and European Union, which is also very important for us to, first of all, get out of this very immediate crisis, because in order to redistribute our wealth, we also need creation, job creation and wealth creation. So that's something that's very important. And to mention one last thing, I was talking about this dialogue. I think you guys, the Latin American dialogue you promoted from the Australian embassy, I think we need to install that culture of dialogue, because in Argentina we're very used to being either in one place or the other. It's like when you go to the countryside after a rain and there's a very hard mark, you can go on this side or this side, and in the middle there's nothing, there's just mud. So the middle ground is what we need to work on, because otherwise there's no way we can keep our policies across time. So that's going to be very important. And lastly, but not less important, our policy towards urbanization and integration of our poor neighborhoods. We passed a law last year with absolute consensus, which basically designs for all of our slum villages a very long-term planification on how to build infrastructure and at the same time provide better educational and community opportunities to bring those neighborhoods to be part of our cities and our towns, not to be a ghetto, but to be part of how we move, how we circulate, how we go from one place to another. So investing in that, I think, is also going to provide a lot of opportunity for us in the future. So that's basically where our mind is on right now.
Yeah, and I guess your mindset is very similar to, I guess, a lot of the mindset of the way political thinkers in Australia think about job creation, about empowering young people, about being able to support, the most vulnerable in our community. But it is all linked up. And I think that, our group of people through the Australia Latam Dialogue group, they think a particular way as well, that, a particular type of Argentine thinker. How can we make that more mainstream? How can we actually bring more people into that conversation that's going to benefit everyone in the community as well? Otherwise, what's the point in having the conversation in the first place if you're just talking to each other and you're just in this little, echo chamber of thinking? So it's something that we really want to be able to do in the future. So I just want to kind of change tack a little bit and talk about the fact that you're a woman in politics, and I've had my own experience of running for pre-selection for our federal parliament as well, and unsuccessfully. So you were a little bit more successful than I was. It's the way politics goes. But this is really over the last 12 months in Australia. In fact, not just 12 months, this has been going on forever here. There's a big conversation about women in politics. Women are still really underrepresented in Australia in all of our levels of parliament, across all sides. We do need to do better. What's your experience being a woman in politics in Argentina? What's life like for women who do get elected into or not even just elected, but that whole, I guess, primary process? What's it like for women?
So it's probably very similar as in Australia. It's still a challenge because it's new. It's relatively new. And if you look at your mother and your grandparents, I always tell the story how my grandma, she started college when she was 45 years old, because before my grandfather didn't approve, and how my mom started working at an earlier age, and how. So it's so recent for us to be able to vote and to be an active part that it's still very challenging. That's for sure. The thing is, from an early age, I think I was educated to believe in myself, just as in any other guy, or just like my brother did. So in our education, I speak about this personally because I think it's very important to talk about early education for women and men, but early education in terms of everything, in terms of power, in terms of financing, because otherwise you grow to think, when you get together with your friends, you speak about babies and family. And when men get together, they speak about what they're using money for, what their savings are being invested in, what the country is doing, and how power works. And that knowledge goes into generations. So you get more confident if you get into the game once you know how the game works, and not just understand it once you're in it. So I strongly believe in early education for women in all issues, but especially in terms of power managing. How are things done? Because that's something that doesn't really transcend. And in that sense, it's very important to have mentors, good mentors, either men or women, regardless, but who trust in your capacity and who promote you and who actually teach you how things work, and how to avoid certain mistakes that are common to when you get in politics. So being a woman is hard because our society is still discussing the role of women. So our generation, I think, is a lot far ahead, and centennials are even further ahead. Yeah. They take it more for granted. So I think it's getting better progressively. If you look at younger generations, you see it's starting not to be an issue anymore. There's other issues, but that's just not an issue anymore. So I really high hopes for future generations too, but I would still really invest in early education and mentoring programs for women in politics, for us not to feel alone, because we always need to work in a network and to find somewhere you belong, which is very important for men too. They just don't say it.
And I think you touched the mentoring thing so important. I said, people often say to me, oh, in your party, they don't support women, the men don't support women. And I say, well, actually, a lot of my mentors have been men. That yes, they're generally more moderate, progressive men, or that sort of wing of the party, but there are those people there who will bring you into their spaces so that you can understand how to navigate those dynamics. We talk about power dynamics. And then at the same time, having your group of women who also understand how different it is and what it's like to kind of navigate that world as well. But those mentors are just they're such an important part of being able to get in there, because we've always been excluded, as young women from these spaces. We sort of joke about, the guys will go play golf or whatever, But the girls now, we will get together and we have our spaces that the men aren't welcome in as well. So one of my friends of mine calls it a policy and petty, and she'll go with a girlfriend and get a pedicure and talk about policy. So it's, you know, these spaces are changing where these conversations happen, and I think that's a really positive thing. But that's a really good segue, actually, because I know that Argentina in many ways is quite progressive. You know, you've just celebrated 10 years of legislating same-sex marriage, and now you're going through this process of allowing, I guess, a third category of gender, which is something that Australia has recognised in some capacities. What's the legislative environment like in this context? Is it progressive? Is it open? Is it diverse? What's it like in Argentina?
So I think we sound more diverse than we actually are because of our legislation in Latin America, which is, it's true, it's progressive for Latin America, but we're still very Latin American in that sense, and we value family so much that there's a very tough discussion around how new values would impact traditional families. Personally, I think it's an issue of freedom, and the more free you are to choose, the better you can be as a human being. And I always think differences or diversities are something not to be tolerated, but to be celebrated, because that makes us richer. Honestly, I think it really does make us richer. And I don't see that colliding with anyone's desire to have a traditional family. I think it's the opposite way. It's not going against anywhere. It's going for everyone and bringing more rights into the discussion. So I would say there's a lot of people who are for this, like you mentioned, this like third determined or undetermined gender, or if you don't want to say or to specify what's your gender. But as of today, I wouldn't say that's a majority right now. And that's the interesting thing, like you said before, about dialogue is and leadership too. I think the objective of leadership is to try to convince others that your ideas are going to be better for the welfare and the well-being of everyone in Argentina. So we had tough times because we started debating depenalization or legalization of abortion, and that kind of took us to a very heated, very, very heated discussion in every Argentine table that in some way backclashed, for example, in diversity. Like in some things, like after that discussion, it took us back in some more conservative surroundings. Honestly, I think, if you look at younger generations, you'll see a pattern how we're more for diversity than our older generations. And honestly, I think it's an issue of freedom, and it's really better for everyone to just accept how others love and how others prefer to form their families. And it doesn't really affect us as long as we're certain, we're sure what we want and what we're doing.
And I guess that goes exactly to why it's so important. We do have, I guess, people of all kinds in our parliaments or Congress and representing us. We actually look like the communities that we're representing. I think that really goes to the heart of why that's so important. But Camila, I'm very mindful of your time, and so I've got one more question to ask, which I think is, a really important one for that next generation. What advice would you give to young people, especially a young woman who is interested in a political career?
I just remembered that I wanted to share this book with you,
Okay.
Dear Madam President.
Yes.
For you, Erin, Dear Madam
Fantastic.
President. Everyone who wants to read this, it was written by Jennifer Palmieri. She was advisor to Obama and then to Hillary Clinton. And you just reminded me of this because she says in this book how both Obama and Hillary in their different leading groups and their closest advisors, they said, so we need to set up a team that's as diverse as our nation. We don't need to have colleagues or advisors that are very similar to us. We need to reach out for something that's different, because that's the way we really are adding value and we're being representative of what's out there. Otherwise, you always have the risk of just speaking among each other and having a more elitist or just a very close-minded attitude. So you just reminded me of that, and that's one of the advices I would suggest to other young people watching this is just always remember that diversity and to have a challenging environment for every team that you build. Challenging is always better than complacent. It's always better. Even if you feel more tired, but it's always, it takes you, you know, to see like a mile ahead. And I would also suggest for everyone in the world to keep sustainability into mind, because it's really affecting everyone, how the world, like climate change, but it's climate crisis, I would call it better. For all young generations, in every single conversation I have, at least once sustainability comes into the questions, I would suggest also like trying to bring the perspective of sustainability as like we have like gender equality, and everything you think of, you consider how it affects differently women and men. So I would try to bring sustainability as a perspective, like how everything we decide, even if it's not strictly environmental, affects our communities and things around us. And I would, and especially, well, for women, I would say, please go for it. Like, don't believe in yourself. Like, if you believe in yourself, honestly, there's like, no one can stop you, because a woman who believes in herself, who's empowered, will find a way through. So, and honestly, I think like this, like, we just met once and we had an amazing connection, and we keep discussing and talking and enriching each other, and like that generosity of sharing each other's experiences and views. And that's something that men have been doing for centuries. So like it's our turn to also like do that, like we did that in raising children, like that ancestral knowledge.
That's right. Yes.
So we have to do that same in power dynamics. So it's our turn to learn that.
We have those skills to be able to build relationships, share information, confide in each other. And I think, you know, the way that actually happens among women, maybe it comes from that nurturing background, but it happens in a very different way, I think, to how it might happen for men. So I think we actually have a big strength there as women when it comes to leadership.
I completely agree with you.
Fantastic, Camila. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, mi amiga. I really appreciate your time. I know the team does as well, and we're so grateful to have met you last year and get your insights and be able to see that perspective of someone who is already in Congress as well, and can contribute to the discussions we're having. But hopefully we can give something back to you as well as young people. And I really look forward to, after all of this, seeing you again back in Buenos Aires. I can't wait to go back and visit my new adopted country, and I can't wait to host you here in Australia at some point as well. Like we'd hope to, but we know we will in the future. And you can bring the whole family as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and my child was growing. I'm about to be pregnant after the first child, so we'll do. We'll go with her, because, like, you know, women in politics also with children. I mean, that's the way. You know,
our kids can have play dates.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Camila.